All right, we're live. Hey, everybody, I'm Nick with Sync Logistics Training, and this is our third learning and development webinar. So they're becoming a thing now. Today, we're going to talk about the importance of ongoing training, something that's really important for all brokers out there. And I got a great panel. So we'll do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll just kind of jump into these discussion questions. So let's see here. Rush, do you want to kick things off?
For sure. I'm Rush Feldhacker. I'm the VP of Strategy at Neon Logistics, formerly with Metaphora, and I'm in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Perfect. Dave, let's move to you next.
Hey guys, I'm Dave Stone. I'm the VP of Domestic Freight Forwarding at Omni Logistics. Prior to Omni, I built out the brokerages at Ryder and Keep Trucking, based here in Dallas. Looking forward to this.
Great. And Seth, on to you.
Hey, good afternoon, guys. My name is Seth Saylor. I'm a fractional leader with Growth Nexus and excited to be here today. Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, no problem, man. All right. So today we are talking about ongoing training, which in my experience is something that gets neglected a lot in brokerage. Like for those brokerages that actually have new hire training figured out, ongoing training is something that even then often gets deprioritized. The mentality typically being, oh, well, like so-and-so is a carrier up making six figures or whatever. Like they're good, like let them do their thing for now. We don't need more training. But like the reality is, in my opinion, at least, is that ongoing training is actually really important, particularly for some of the newer generations coming into the industry. Like they need and want more training and more professional development opportunities. Hopefully I'm not alone in thinking this, because our first question is, why is ongoing training important? And we'll use that to kind of kick things off. Dave, you want to start things? Why is ongoing training important?
Yeah, no, good question. I think like as a whole, when I kind of look at training, I put it into kind of 5 buckets in my opinion, right? So you do have the new hire kind of initial systems training. And then I think you have all this other training that kind of sits out there, right? And you'll hear folks that'll say they have like leadership and, cultural type training. You'll have, some updated training, some fixing of issues training, some marketing training, industry tips type training. And I think, you're exactly right that a lot of folks focus purely on the new hire, purely on the onboarding. And some will say it's best in class and they'll do it in 2 weeks. And some will say theirs is better and they'll do it in 2 months, or, I've seen training up to a year. And I think all that stuff's good, but I think the piece from a ongoing training perspective is, that training is great until you make it to the floor, right? It's that old adage of Mike Tyson, right? Everybody's got a plan until they get hit in the face. I think the same thing goes for training, because what happens in training is you do this phenomenal training, you get out to the floor, and the first day on the floor, what does the rep next to you say? Hey man, that doesn't work. This is how we really do it. And so I think that's where the ongoing training really takes root. Is maybe there's some stuff that happens on the floor that is good, and you should be training on that. Maybe there's some stuff on the floor that shouldn't be happening. How do you untrain that? And how do you really keep that person on the floor moving effectively and doing the things that they need to do? And I think, we're all in this business for a couple different reasons, but ultimately you want to help that person make the most possible money that they can, doing it the right way and doing it the way in which your company wants to do it. And so I think for me, as I think through, why is it important? It's making the main thing the main thing. What is training supposed to do? It's supposed to ensure that it's done the same way, the correct way, and the way in which your company wants to do it. And I keep on saying your company because each company is going to have it a little bit different. But I think as long as you're putting the training as a full program and not just having an onboarding new hire training, what you allow for folks to do is you allow them to learn something initial, get a little bit of time in the saddle, come back to the training and understand it a little bit more, go back out on the floor and do a little more to get time in the saddle. And all of a sudden, when you look back at that person a year from now, you're going to see somebody that has the full understanding of what it means to be successful in whatever role that they have. So, for me, it is making sure that folks actually are doing things the way you need them done versus just you trained it one time, you left them alone, and they're off doing their completely separate process that you may or may not have any access to understanding how they're doing that.
I love that answer. I'll just hit on a couple of things that you said. I really like how you brought up the fact that people will say, I know this is how we're trained, but this is how we really do it. Because we see it all the time talking to our customers where shadowing is a huge part of their training, right? Shadowing is great. like I personally think shadowing is always going to be a component of training, but you have to make sure that like whoever's being shadowed is actually reinforcing what you want them to learn. Because most of the time what happens is you go shadow somebody and they say, hey, I know you were taught to do things this way, but this is how I do things. So like, let's do things this way instead. And it creates inconsistencies everywhere.
I think in those situations too, what you end up with, right, is a lot of brokerages have pod style, right? And inside of those pods, what do you end up with? You end up with a couple folks that do it the way that you trained it, and you end up with folks in other pods that do it completely different. And typically, what's the response from a leadership standpoint? Well, let's look at the revenue. Let's look at the margins. And if that pod's doing it, revenue's king. We're not going to talk to them. And that's not necessarily indicative of the leadership, but what it is if you understand what they're doing successfully, are you leaving money on the table in that other pod that maybe isn't doing it the effective way that you trained it on? And so I think that's where that ongoing training and that understanding of what's happening on the floor is so important to really drive through how it can actually help these folks on the floor, quote unquote, make more money.
Yeah, totally agree. Rush, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think on your point, when you talk about shadowing, which I think every company uses, who do you have your new reps sit with? Well, typically you have them sit with your most tenured employees who have been out of training the longest, who have the worst habits in the office. And so what you then do is you have everyone that you just trained become untrained. So just a real basic reason that ongoing training is so important is that those employees that have been around the longest, which are typically the hardest to train, are doing things the right way. And it's really important to be measuring everything to know when habits are forming that that differ from what you want. And then you can also measure when we implement training, how successful was it? And you can tweak your training plan based on those results.
I think also on that too. I mean, everyone on this panel that I know have been doing this for double-digit years. This industry changes. And it changes fast. So, while the training that was implemented when I started, or Rush when you started, or Dave, Nick, that training's also involved with our industry. And I'm a big proponent of, if you do not continue to reinvent yourself, you will get left behind. So that ongoing training is not just so much yes, to Dave's point, 100%, and to Rush's point as well, this is who we are as company A, this is how we're going to do things. But that ongoing training also has to continue to modify with what's happening in our industry today. So we continue to reinvent our employees to give them those professional growth opportunities of development.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Seth. And I think about it, from a tactical perspective. Think about how we've onboarded carriers in a brokerage setting for years, right? I mean, it has completely changed. And nowadays, how we onboard a carrier is different than how we did it a year ago based on the fraud, or it's different than 2 years ago, or it's different than 3 years ago when COVID was happening. It is completely changed. And so I think you're exactly spot on when you talk about that, because it's not just a matter of trying to get rid of some of these bad habits or making sure that habits are understood. It is complete changes in strategy as it relates to how your company is going to do things going forward, right? And I think the carrier piece is 100% a valuable example today, because I'll guarantee you that every single brokerage that's out there today looks at how they onboard carriers, and whether it's the technology that's changed, right? Some have gone from different technology platforms, or whether it's just in terms of the questions you ask to the carrier, or whether it's in terms of the things you look at when a carrier's emailing you in to ask if they can onboard with you, right? All of those things have changed in a matter of, I'll call it a year, but it's even less than that on a lot of these carriers, just based on some of the fraud and techniques that they're using. So you're exactly right.
Yeah, I see that come up periodically, just not exclusively with fraud, but with any technology out there. Looking at some of the pricing or capacity tech in the world right now compared to what it was 10 years ago. I mean, people need to be trained on completely different processes sometimes. The fundamentals of building carrier relationships are probably the same, but how you engage with them and how you interact with your carriers is really different. Let's see. My next question, admittedly somewhat duplicative of the first one. What are the objectives of ongoing training? We may have hit on this already, but does anybody have any comments they want to add on that? Objectives of ongoing training?
I think it's just to improve your employees and to improve the company as a whole, and to As you uncover maybe like deficiencies or bad habits inside the company, it's a great opportunity to fix those. I think it needs to be very targeted. I don't think you just need to train on something. For us, it's usually we run some sort of cadence report and we see a metric that we don't like, and we try to tackle that head on. So yeah, that's my input on that one.
I think just to tap onto that, Rush, I mean, we've all, Dave, Rush, myself, have led brokerages and 3PLs in some aspect. I think to get the objective there is to get our employees to understand the why of why we're doing it, because to all of our points, you go sit with the most tenured person, they're bringing in the most revenue. Today's point, kind of leave them alone. But if we're asking to do something else as leaders in a brokerage or an asset-based company or anywhere where you're talking about training, it's boiling down to getting them to buy into the why we're doing this and make it relevant to them, the person, as well as the employee. It doesn't always cure the problem, but it does give a little bit more buy-in to the objection to where they'll at least go along with it and see if it's really all it's cracked up to be.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect point. So my piece on it, is what does the team want from a training component, right? So oftentimes we'll go through and ask the team, like, what is it that we're missing? What part are you struggling with on a daily basis that you just either our initial training didn't do it, our ongoing training doesn't do it? Like, what is it that you're looking for? And maybe that's simple stuff from a sales perspective, right? Where, hey, I'm being hit with objections and I just don't know how to get past them. All right, let's train on that. Or maybe it's, hey, what does it take for me to book more loads, right? Very simple in nature, but all right, let's take a look at that. But I think it's engaging with the team, because to Seth's point, making sure they understand the why we're doing this. We're not doing training to do training. Like, there's other components on it. So, make sure that you're engaging with the team. But the other side of that is exactly what Rush and Seth said, which is look at the data. The data should drive the objectives of the training. If you're struggling in certain areas with certain problems, then the training should allow for those things to be addressed. And you know what? Maybe it is that the training's incorrect and you need to actually update your training, or maybe it's as simple as behavioral issues, or maybe it's something as simple as folks didn't know, and you do have to train completely on those pieces. So I think let the data drive the conversation, ask them what they're looking for, and then develop the training based off of that.
Yeah. Something that's come up in previous webinars has been how particularly ongoing training needs to be like highly individualized, in part for the reasons that we just talked about. Like, everyone has their own struggles and their own like KPI that they're struggling to hit or whatever, but also everyone also has their own goals and objectives, right? Like, it seems to be a default sometimes to kind of push people into a management path, but the reality might be that some people don't want to be in management. Some people just want to be an individual contributor and keep going down that path. So like, in terms of figuring out what the objectives are, it's tough because different people have different objectives. I think that kind of ties into my next discussion question here. Like, how do you know what to train people on? And like, we can go a lot of different directions with this, but I'm kind of curious your guys' take on like different roles within an organization. So say someone's in carrier sales or customer sales, or if it's like a cradle to grave person, or if they're in management, are there any particular like topics that jump out to you? Like, how do you go about figuring that out? Who wants it first?
I can jump in here. So I think one of the things that we've tried to do in roles in which I've been in is to create those standard operating procedures for folks to be able to know what their role is, right? And that's not an absolute in the sense of like, thou shalt do this every single time, but it is a good piece, especially as it relates to certain components in a technical sense, right? So an example is, I just want a load from a shipper. Awesome, congrats. What's my next step? How do I request credit? How do I dump it into the system? How do I get this customer set up? Like, those are things that are very easy in the sense of, well, everybody should just know this. But if you don't do it correct at the start of it, guess what happens, right? You don't get the billing set up correct. You don't actually invoice the customer correct. And now you're in a world of hurt because the customer, quote unquote, isn't paying their bills, and you're upset with this customer. So creating those standard operating procedures allows you the opportunity to get it right the first time on those things that maybe are mundane or things that don't come up every single day. And so when we think about, what to train people on, the next component of that is obviously an audit function, right? Did we do it correct? How did we perform this function that I expected to be a certain way? And if I didn't do it correct, well, then you have a couple different options, right? I can go the punitive route and beat them up. So I'll leave that for a different day. Or we start asking the questions related to the training, right? Was the training good? Was it bad? Were there certain things that we didn't do inside the training? Did certain things not click in? Is there something we should do better going forward? Is it just a behavioral issue? So I think those are pieces that you start to go down the route as you start to include audits in your process. And you can take those audits to the nth degree, right? Hey, when a phone call is made, are we listening to the phone call from a leadership perspective, providing coaching, training, and things of that nature? But the overarching message on that is, how do you know what to train people on? Get to the floor. Leaders should be on the floor. They should be listening. They should be engaging. They should be asking the questions. Hey, we trained on this. I see you're doing it this way. Is there a reason? Is there something else we can do better on that? But it's got to be on the floor in the moment where you're asking those questions. And then, from a create the training plan, you can create training that takes folks into a room to talk through those things. You can create training plans that's on the floor. You can create your one-sheeter training plans, but it's all based on, am I on the floor? Am I engaging? Am I understanding what they should do and whether that is occurring or not? And what do I go from there?
And Dave, on those audits, we listen to a select number of phone calls for every rep over every week and every month, and it probably gives us more insight into what we need to train on than anything does. And it's as simple as saying, this is our process for booking a carrier. All right, let's listen to 5 phone calls for every rep. Which of these did they hit? Which of these did they not hit? What do we need to train the entire team on? And what needs to have individual coaching? And we've seen a significant increase in all the metrics that we're judging just based off of doing those QA checks.
Yeah.
If I can jump up, go ahead, Nick.
Go for it, Seth.
If I can just jump on the back of that, it's something the 4 of us talked about before we hopped on here. I think it gives us a good look as leaders on when we're going through that training content and rolling it out to our team and individuals, whether it's in a group setting or individual setting, how are we presenting that and what's our retention rate on that? Because we're in a society today where everything is instantaneous. Everything is fast. We should be able to get anything we want as fast as we want it, and we know it perfectly. I think that for a lot of us, we want to get that ROI and get that person on the floor to do their role at a high level, that we sometimes probably ought to be careful doing that and shoving all the information as quickly as we can to get them through the training as quick as we can, because we really want them to retain what they've got and what we've given them. Because if we don't do so, it's going to cost us more time and more money to go back and redo these things than to have to get done right on the front end.
Yeah. And not even the money. Yeah. Not even the money for retraining, but kind of what Dave was talking about earlier with carrier compliance, like the consequences of getting that wrong now are much higher than they've ever been.
Exactly.
Yeah. Like that's sort of a challenge that we run into when we talk to people about training, because at least in my experience, like the impact of bad training, like oftentimes isn't really like visible unless you're like looking for it and like, what you're doing, or unless something bad happens, right? Like if something bad happens, like say you get a load stolen, then you look at your process and you're like, oh shit, maybe we should have actually trained people on how to like vet carriers better. And all of a sudden it's in your face and you realize, but it can be tough if you're not actually proactively looking for that stuff.
I think that's a really good point, because in that example of like load is stolen, right? Like, all right, well, what happened? Oh, we posted on a load board. We took this carrier that was, had a Gmail address or whatever the case may be, right? And we always come back typically to the person that booked it, and we said, all right, here's your slap on the wrist. Like, what are you doing? You can't do that. You knew what the training was, right? But I think to Seth's point, and this is where, in my opinion, training is more of a cultural component than anything else, right? If you build the environment where ongoing training is going to meet folks where they're at, and they are a very, everybody in this society right now is very, I want my information, I want it now, and I want it in short bursts, and I want it's the TikTok type of environment, right? Give me the 15 seconds. What do I need to be aware of? How do I protect myself? And let's move on, right? Versus, the old school days of like, all right, guys, we're gonna spend an hour and you're gonna go through all this training, and after this, you're gonna sign this form and you're gonna be good to go, and like life is good and you'll never make this mistake again. I think we have to set that as part of the culture where I'm going to review things in such a way that allows folks to retain that information. So it's not just, if you do this, I punish you. It's a matter of, hey, if we do this, great. Here's what the results are, right? You get better margins, you get better customer satisfaction, you get customers that are never concerned when they book loads with you because they know you got a great process set up. Like, and you almost use that as a selling point when you're talking with customers or when you're building those relationships with carriers, right? And I think that's the piece that ongoing training really allows. And folks want it, right? So somebody on the floor doesn't want you to walk over and go, oh man, you messed up, like pack your bags, see you later. They want that constant engagement where, hey, if you do this correctly, here's what it's going to result in your money piece or your margin piece. If you do this correct, then here's what the results will be. And I think that sets the right tone for why training is so important and why it becomes a major driver in the overall culture of a business. And I'll throw this hot take out there. You take any brokerage that says they have great culture, look at the training piece behind it. Yes, you can look at the margin or the incentive plan and talk through all that, but like, look at their training. If they do not have ongoing training, that brokerage is bound to fail at some point. And maybe they're just on their honeymoon, but they will fail eventually.
I love how you brought up the training piece. As a little bit of shameless self-promotion here, it ties nicely into a panel I moderated at the last TIA that was about like building your brand and the impact that training has on that. Because if you think about it, like your brokerage is really only as good as its people, right? And for better or worse, your people are only as good as you train them to be, and they're the ones who are out there representing your company to every audience that you've got. They're talking to customers, they're talking to prospective customers, they're talking to carriers, they're talking to other potential employees, right? So if you're not training your people and you're not developing that culture, like how are they representing you to all of these audiences that you care about? So like I think that culture piece is super important.
And from a business strategy perspective, for example, Neon wants to be the #1 communication company in the industry. If you're not training your team on how to do that, then you're never going to accomplish that. So your training needs to be built around like not only what your culture to be, but where is your company situated in the market and what's the other objectives that you're trying to accomplish.
So question here about ongoing training. Like we can take ongoing training a long way. Like training should be a part of your career, like no matter what stage in your career that you're at. When you guys think about like your careers, what kind of training would you have wanted, or like what kind of training do you guys want right now?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
So that's a really good.
It's not on my discussion list. I'm throwing a curveball at you.
Wow.
I was sat in front of a computer with the phone and was told to make calls on day one after I set up my station. And it honestly took me like 2 full weeks at age 22 to realize like, what is it that we're actually doing? Like, how do we make money? Are we selling to shippers? Are we selling to carriers? Like I didn't understand it at all. And then, once somebody kind of took me aside and was like, hey, this is how this works. I was able to kind of like make some ground up, but the company lost 3 or 4 weeks of time on me because no time was invested in me. And I wish, especially for newer hires right out of college, somebody had kind of taken me into a classroom and said, this is how the industry works. Here's some of the terminology, just the real basics. Cause I would have gotten up to speed a lot quicker had that been approached differently.
Oddly enough, you're not the only one who's mentioned that to me. I've had several people come up to me like, I didn't understand how we made money. I didn't get that the fact that like we paid carriers X amount and customers this amount and the margin between was what we were actually making money on. I had no idea. As soon as that was clarified, I made a lot more phone calls and more money. Mm-hmm. Seth, Dave, any thoughts?
I would consider myself one of the lucky ones when I came out of school. My training program at Barry Transportation was absolutely incredible. It was a great experience. They did a lot of good things there. Unlike Rush, they taught me how I do what I was doing when I got to my desk. I still didn't know everything, but by any stretch of the imagination, but I had an idea of who I was selling to and felt confident in what I was going to do when I picked up that telephone for the first time. But as it sits today, at a later part of the career, I've been a P&L leader of asset-based companies, 3PL companies, and I haven't seen, where is that executive level coaching if that's your goal, right? How do you've got people around you that get to an executive level or get to that higher level, and you want to keep that trajectory going forward, but how do you get there without being trained how to do that? I would like to think that's not that, just throw in the fire and figure it out. That's where I would like to see, you talk about my professional career now, more executive level training to make, some bigger visionary ideas and move that direction. I think a lot of people our age, my age, they continue to move up and they get to that level, and then they get there and you kind of look around, you're like, okay, now what? And now you're getting that Harvard education that you didn't pay for, and it's sink or swim. And I think there's a little bit of a gap there that could certainly be addressed. And I would like to do for myself.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I think the training that I've seen over the years, it's probably why I'm so passionate about it, right, is, in every role that I've had, typically the training has been a shadow session, right? Go sit with so-and-so. They will train, right? And so-and-so, maybe they had a bad day, right? Maybe they had just a ton of stuff going on and life wasn't good, right? And so maybe I got subpar training. Maybe they're a rock star and they love to train and training was their forte and they trained me extremely well. And I think it's just hit or miss based on what person I got in a given day. And I think that's the piece that I think we ultimately have to get away from, right? Is this idea that Johnny on the floor is the best operator, so therefore Johnny on the floor is the one that trains. I think there's certain folks that can train, and we should utilize those folks to train, and we should train it with an approach that is appropriate for the role in which that person's doing. And I think to Seth's point, right, oftentimes, how do you move up? Well, you're the greatest operator in that role, and so naturally they promote you up, right? And then you're the greatest operator in that role, and then they move you up. And I think where we lose sight of, or where training ultimately needs to go, is how do I make sure that you are quote unquote ready for that next role? And maybe that's getting you to think like that role, right? Hey, in this role, you're going to be faced with a ton of these types of challenges. How do you respond? How do you get into that? And so you start to create training plans for folks that are maybe examples of things that person in that role today has experienced, or maybe they're examples of things that the person in that role has complained the most that they struggle with, and you're training that person on it. But I think it's constantly looking at how do you develop a training plan that allows people to know that they are getting the training that's going to set them up for success. And I think Rush mentioned it, right? Like taking phone calls and being told, hey, this is how your day is going to be operated. That's, sink or swim. And we joke about it, right? I was one of the ones that made it through, and that's exciting. But I think at the end of the day, like, how do you take a role and know what that person's going to be doing from a roles and responsibilities, and then build the training plan related to that and expand it out such that they can be successful? And I think that by creating almost milestones in that approach, right? Where, hey, if you get to this point, you're a novice. If you get to this point, you're intermediate. If you get to this point, you're an expert, and you know this role explicitly well. I think those are critical to helping folks succeed, kind of where they can succeed. And then you expand that out into leadership roles, right? If I'm a leader, what are my novice, intermediate, and expert roles? And then if I'm an executive, like, how do I know that I'm crushing it? Or how do I know I'm successful as an executive? And build those training plans related to that.
I really like that. The whole idea of training for the next role, I haven't specifically had someone tell me before. And I think it's super accurate and really useful. I'm like sitting here thinking about it right now. Like in my background, I totally haven't done that, right? Like my training was, hey, you're in this new role. I guess you better learn how to figure out how to manage people now, right? And I was like, oh, crap. I guess this is what we're doing now. Or when I got to a position where I had more like financial responsibility over a company, it's like, oh, this is a P&L. That's a lot of numbers. Wonder what we do with this. So yeah, like training for the next role, I think is super important.
I really like how Dave framed that out and making it to where they actually, a company could set that type of training up to where an employee could actually see a true progression in career path if that's what they wanted to go do. I think we get a lot of people coming into our organizations at times, and we train them. We do a really good job training them and give them everything they need to go be successful. We send them out there, they go crush it. We're happy they're crushing it. And, we don't continue to do that ongoing training to get them to that next level. And I've always been a believer in, we want, as leaders, we should do everything we can to reinvest back in our people and give them the skill sets necessary to succeed here. And I've heard from other leaders who are like, well, what if they go somewhere else and do better? That's exactly what we got hired to do, to make them as best as possible. But our plan is to obviously retain. But I think Dave's vision of how you lay that out on retaining and showing a career path is really, really solid. Because without that, you're kind of just sitting there wondering, like, well, okay, I'm doing really well. Now what?
I think the other side, and I'll throw this point out there, Seth, because I think it's important, right? And we do talk about that a lot, which is, well, I want to retain people and I want to keep them, but what if they leave? And my answer always on that is like, yeah, if they leave, guess what? I got a contact in another company that I know is going to crush it. And so if there's anything that I need to be able to support what I'm doing, well, guess what? I'm one phone call away from having somebody help me in this regard, right? And I think that's the difference is you shouldn't want to just keep people underneath your roof. And maybe your business is big enough such that you have other departments, right? And this is very easy to do and they can move into other departments. But I think that even if you're in a small brokerage and somebody has reached the absolute pinnacle and now they're landlocked, right? Somebody's in front of them where that person's not leaving for a while. Okay, well, is it better for me to turn around and say, hey, man, keep crushing it and you're doing a good job and like eventually we'll get you there? Or is it better for me to say, hey, if you moved on to someplace else, guess what? I know you're going to go crush it there. You're going to, number one, make our brand look better because we trained you and we helped you and we coached you and we got you up. And then maybe you're going to influence those other folks. And now all of a sudden it becomes a matter that we are helping the entire logistics and transportation space as a whole. That's a pretty cool environment to be a part of. And I mean, there's the piece where, if I need something, I'm going to pick up the phone and call you. But the other side of it is you're building this environment where more folks are being able to be successful. More folks are having the careers that all of us really have had inside this space. More folks are able to experience the fun and excitement and thrill of being in the space for a long period of time. I think that's a pretty cool outcome when you look at just what the training did and what it allowed you to go off and do with that person.
I agree.
Yeah, that is a cool outcome of it. I hadn't really thought that through either. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and move on to the next question I got here. It's like, what are some of the challenges of ongoing training and how do you address them? I'm specifically curious about like resistance to training because that comes up a lot. Who wants to tackle this one first?
From a sales side, it's hard for a lot of our salespeople to think long term that me leaving the floor for a couple hours to do training is going to make me more money in the long term because they're more focused on, hey, you're taking me off the floor for 2 hours. Like I need to be selling. I have issues to put out. I think our industry is really fast paced. A lot of things are going on. Thinking that you're going to be able to get a large portion of any of your teams to be able to take the same amount of or the same time frame off to do training and then not be distracted by the other things going on isn't the right thought. So kind of, what Dave was saying again about this TikTok generation of like they want their information on demand when they want it is now true more than ever because like the biggest issues we face are people being distracted in training or training starts and it's, hey, I'm putting out some fires or I'm dealing with an issue. I don't have time for this. So that's kind of the issues that we face when we try to do just the standard, pull everyone into a conference room and go over something type training.
Yeah, I've had more leaders in my office telling me how dumb my training is because I'm pulling their reps off the floor for a period of time. Like that, I have more memories of that than probably anything else, right? I understand where they're coming from, right? I mean, especially you pull a carrier sales rep off the floor to coach on how to better negotiate, and you want to do some mock calls and things of that nature. Now all of a sudden you've put that floor at risk of potentially not being able to cover the freight, right? So I get those pieces. And I think that's where you got to figure out what the mix is, right? And sometimes that mix is as simple as covering things at stand-ups. Sometimes that mix is a little more involved where you do need to have somebody that's backing up that person so you can pull them off. I think it goes back to you got to make sure that you have a program in place, right? You can't just walk out to the floor tomorrow and say, hey guys, we're going to train on this piece because you guys all suck in this area. Like that will never go well. But I think having the idea that I want to train on this area or this subject, and here's kind of my umbrella approach to it. I'm going to hit for the next week, these 3 topics and stand-ups. And then the following week, I'm going to do knowledge checks to see if that retained. And then I'm going to audit the process to see if any of that retained. And then eventually, maybe I get to the point where I have to pull somebody off the floor and have, in-depth, individualized type of training. I think it's having that process in place, laying it out with the leaders, making sure the leaders are bought into it so it never surprises somebody in terms of what the training is. They also get a say in what that works, right? Hey, don't pull my brokers off the floor until after 2 p.m. or don't allow my salespeople to be off the floor for longer than an hour, or whatever the case may be. It just goes back to set the program in place so that you can have it. But I think, the challenges are exactly what Russ just said. You're pulling people off the floor, and I'm off the floor means I'm not calling a customer. I'm not engaging with a carrier. How is this making more money? And it's the idea of, you take 2 steps back to be able to sprint forward. I think that's the piece that you got to prove it out to people. And truthfully, it's a hard proof. It's not easy, but at the end of the day, I think as long as you have a plan in place in terms of what it looks like, and you stick to that plan, and you have your standard operating training plan related to things, I think folks buy into it and they understand what you're trying to do.
So you hit on a couple of things there that a couple of our customers talk about a lot. One being consistency and the other one being leadership buy-in. So from a consistency perspective, if people know that like every Friday from like 10 to 10:20 or whenever, we're going to do like a recap of certain topics, or we're going to do a little bit of ongoing training on this, then it becomes a little bit of an easier pill for them to swallow if there's just that consistency to it. And 2, like the leadership buy-in piece, I have one customer, like she's one of my favorite people in L&D in the space. And she, to get leadership buy-in, she makes all of her leaders go through training before she gives it to C-level employees. And believe it or not, they hate it, right? They hate the entire concept of it. But she sends me their feedback after she did this. And all of the feedback is along the same lines of, I didn't want to do this. I thought this was going to be a complete waste of my time, but you made me do it. And lo and behold, like I learned some things that I knew I was trained on initially that I completely forgot about. I know my people on the floor aren't doing X, Y, Z. So please go ahead and give it to all of our seat level people. Take them off the floor for half an hour, whatever. We know it's going to be useful because it was useful for us. I thought that was just brilliant. She has like the luxury of being able to do that. It's a large company, but I thought it was great.
I think the other side of that too is as you bring in potentially other leaders, and I've done this at the director level, on down, as you bring folks in, get them to go through your training in the simplest form, right? So if you're bringing in somebody to be over your brokerage, make them go cover a load, make them go sell to a shipper, make them do the things that your training is teaching folks on, take their feedback. Because number one, it's going to be tough for them to do it in terms of what you have them doing it as. But number 2, folks are going to buy into that, hey, it's not just us reps on the floor that's doing it. It's the full leadership team that's doing it as well. And you get their buy-in from that. And then number 3, right, you're going to get a ton of feedback on that. Like what worked, what didn't. Hey, I really struggled here. When you guys say to do it this way, I actually do it this way from a different environment. And I think, this is, maybe we have a little check and adjust piece on how you guys are training this, and maybe this helps out. So I think those are ways in which you can do it at the leadership level for folks that are coming in that are new as well.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Seth, any comments on that one?
It just compounds on what we've all been saying. I mean, it goes back to the why. You give it to the leadership team, or you don't give it to the leadership team. You give it to everyone on the floor, and they're going to come to the leaders of the group and say, "Why are we doing this?" And leaders are literally going to look at them and go, "I don't know. You were told to." By giving to the leadership team or having the leadership team at least involved in that process, and to your point, Nick, wow, I learned something new. I forgot about this training. You know what? I remember this, but now I look at it this way because of the experience and what we're specifically doing as an organization to push forward. We can tweak this and be more efficient and better off doing it this way. It continues that buy-in because they can answer the question of why. I don't know if it's a very acceptable answer in most scenarios, but if we can always take it back to what we were talking about earlier. If you make it relevant for every seat and every person and give them the why on why we're doing this, they don't have to agree with it, but we are doing this because X. And if we do it this way, it will produce Y. And to David's point, I think it was David and Rush both made earlier, those whys or the reason why we're doing this, 9 times out of 10 can always be driven back to a data point. Always. Whether it's sales, carrier sales, operations, margin, it can all be driven back to data. And numbers don't lie. Always find the why.
Yeah.
So going along with that data point, how do you know if your ongoing training is being effective? Rush, you want to start with this one?
It's just about measuring it. Yeah, it's just about measuring everything. If you're just shooting from the hip, like, hey, I heard somebody not follow the process today, we need to train on this, then you're setting yourself up for failure. You really do have to have the data to back it up. And to Seth's point, it's important to say, hey, team, our digital tracking is at 68%. That's not an acceptable number. So we're doing this training to get it to 85+%. But you have to measure before and you have to measure after. You have to see what parts of your training weren't picked up on. So yeah, I mean, it's just all about metrics, and it's all about doing those audits and looking at your reports.
Yeah. Dave, Seth, anything to add on that one? How do you know if training is being effective?
I think first and foremost, your people are going to tell you, right? If you're on the floor and you're engaging with them, they're going to tell you, hey man, this ain't working. Here's why. And if you get the ones that don't just leave it at that actually give you the 3 things that's what you could do to actually fix it so that training will work. I think those are the folks that you keep close, right? So first and foremost, be on the floor, engage with the people. I think to Rush's point, like the data tells everything. And I think the training has to be related to something you are trying to drive. And then I'll take it one step further. Take that, calculate it into a dollar amount that it means something to them, right? So let's take a super easy example. If we do this training, we will increase your loads booked per day by 1 load per day, right? All right, cool. Why? What does it matter? Well, if you book that 1 load per day, that's an extra, let's say $100 in margin that gets added to you. Over 5 days, that's $500 in margin. Over a month, you start to move this into a dollar amount. That means your incentive is going to be an extra, 10%. Let's just say $200 a paycheck into your pocket every single time, just by doing that one. That's it. So we're going to train to get you to that one. And then guess what? We're going to come back and look and see, did it actually work or didn't it? And if it didn't, we'll check and adjust and we'll go from there. But by tying it back to why, I mean, most of these folks want that extra dollar amount. You start to put money into their pocket, they'll start to believe in this, regardless of if it's the way in which they wanted to do it or the way in which they thought was dumb. It doesn't really matter. You start to tie it back into that. So I'm notorious for making sure that there's a dollar amount attached to it on any KPI that we're trying to drive, because I think that's the piece. Them turning around and getting 1 extra load, for me, from a P&L perspective, matters completely different than from what it means to them on the floor, and making sure that it is at that desk level and they understand what it's going to do to help them grow their book of business in whether that's carrier sales or operations or whether that's customer sales, doesn't matter.
Yeah, I've talked about that a lot, kind of in terms of, I phrase it as like the value of incremental change, right? If you tell someone they're going to book 1 extra load today, they're like, cool, man, right? 1 extra load every day this week. Again, they're like, I guess. But once you start kind of adding that up, like whatever that like $200 per load adds up to over the next like day, week, month, year, and they see the actual dollar signs, like I'm 100% with you. Like that needs to be broken down to people. Seth, anything to add on to this one about what was the question? Oh yeah, how do you know if it's effective? Sorry.
I think the other thing to do there, Rush and Dave covered it very well. The only thing I would add to that is this industry we're in is hard. I don't know if anyone knew that. It's hard out there. Like this thing is hard. In case no one knew, now you know. You've been told it's hard. Okay, it's not easy. And I think when we go into training and we talk about driving metrics and looking at KPIs and trying to get better, to Rush's point on the tracking as his example, it's important as leaders to celebrate small wins because they matter. People get told no, they have tough days every single day, that they get almost every single day. It happens. So as you're building these things out and have these conversations and talking about trainings and driving these metrics and any little bit of improvement, I think it's important to recognize that, because a thank you or a good job goes a really long way for a group of people.
Yeah. I gotta say something on that, Seth. I mean, that is one of the critical components that I think is often lost, right? And those wins don't have to be an extra load, right? I mean, those wins can be, this customer I've been bugging for a year finally let me quote on a single lane. Like, that's a win. And so I think it is calling those things out, and it's calling those things out in that consistency fashion, right? So whether that's, celebration calls every week where you line up the team and you say, hey, we're going to talk about all the great things you guys did, because this industry is hard and you get kicked in the teeth a lot and you struggle a lot. And so getting those pieces on board with, oh man, like there are some wins and this stuff's starting to feed on it, right? You start to build that flywheel where winning becomes contagious and all of a sudden everybody wants to win in that. And it is those super small wins that matter the most when you're trying to build out the organization that values things like training. You got to celebrate those things in any capacity that you can. And what we've used in the past is, this celebration where everybody gathers up, it's emails out to the entire team. It's getting senior leaders to engage with that person and say, hey man, you absolutely crushed it. Way to go. Heard you did this great thing. But it can't just be related to a KPI. It's got to be those things that are underneath that are driving the business as well.
So I've got 2 questions left here that I want to knock out. The first being around hiring experienced employees. Seth, I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but like, what do you do with those folks? Because a lot of times, like, this can go really well or it can go really badly. What kind of training do you give somebody who's been in the industry before that you're hiring at your brokerage? Dave, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah. I mean, that if you're bringing somebody into the brokerage, right, and they have experience, the thing that you often run into is, well, that's not the way we've done it. It's different than what we've done in the past. And I think for me, a lot of it boils back to setting the expectations up front. So anybody that I bring in, the interview cycle is going to contain certain pieces related to that thought process. You may have done it differently in a different environment. Here's how we're going to do it here. This is why I think it works. This is why I think it's important. And if you set that expectation up front, that they're going to go through the training process as it relates to your organization, I think it goes a long way. I think that the challenge often is when folks come in and you didn't set that expectation and you say, hey, that's not the way we've done it. Well, I make a whole bunch of money here. You brought me over because my book of business is X and I can do this. And then you run into the piece of like, well, do I challenge them or do I, that revenue is kind of nice on my P&L. Do I just let it go? And I'm a big believer in you have to set the right baseline for everybody else to be able to succeed. And I know we talked about it from a leadership perspective of folks going through, but I'm a big believer in anybody that comes into the brokerage. It doesn't matter what level they're at. And it doesn't matter how big their book of business has been or what organization they worked at in the past. We run them through our training to ensure that they have everything set up so they can be successful and at least understand why we're doing the things we're doing. So if they hear it on the floor, they don't try to turn around and say, no, that's not the way it is.
Yeah. Like our customers who see the most success with folks that they've onboarded who have experience do exactly that. They run them through some, if not all, of their training just to make sure everyone's kind of on the same page about what's going on. So definitely enjoyed that one. What else do I have here? How to leverage technology in training. I'm trying not to be too self-serving about this one because it kind of plays into sync to a degree here. But I know we were talking about it earlier in terms of some of the cool like LMSs and AI tools out there. Does anyone have thoughts on how to leverage technology for training?
I think it goes back to, I don't remember who said, so I'm sorry for not giving credit to whoever this is. I think it has to be individualized. People have different learning tendencies and learning capabilities. Some are visual, some are hands-on, some are multiple different facets of how they learn and how they retain information. I mean, there's tech out there, shameless plug for Sync. You've got that out there for that type of program to where it's a little bit more self-guided. There's other technology out there that it's literally putting you in the saddle, to Dave's point earlier, of getting on a call and getting that feedback of a gatekeeper, working through those scenarios on things you may have learned. I think there's multiple different facets on how we can get our employees trained up in a very efficient manner. but it goes back to how are we using or leveraging these tools, these awesome tools that we have in the year of 2024 to best fit the learning style of this particular trainee.
Yeah.
For us, usually the technology-based training comes early on. Our TMS has an academy that does a really good job of just teaching the basics of this is how you build a facility in the system, this is how you build a load, this is how you add credit, and just like all the basics. I think where the industry's gone and something that Sync does is the calls and the AI assisted training on that end. And we haven't delved into it, but plan to in the future. And I'm excited to see what that can do. Having to, like, you think about teaching somebody to build a load. If you had to teach every single person that came into your company manually how to use the TMS system, like the time waste there is just huge. And so tech really helps there. So I'm excited to see what it can do for the more complex parts of the training process.
Yeah, I think how I've seen kind of training evolve. I have two boys that are in school, and I watch how they are doing online type of training environments, right? And a lot of it is not necessarily just running through a video. A lot of it is, we're going to show you this, and then we expect you to repeat this. And if you don't repeat it, we're going to show you where it's wrong, and then we're going to have you go back through it again. But it's this interactive component in terms of what it takes to learn. And I think that's where a lot of folks are looking for it today, right? So the old adage, and if you saw my desk, right, I have a big old thick TMS book that sits on my desk for me to run through and remember how to do certain pieces in the TMS from a technical standpoint. And that was once a training way that we used to train people is, hey, here's the TMS book, like just go review it and like you'll be fine. But I think nowadays it's more related to how do you set up the training such that I'm going to go build a load in the system. Awesome. Here's the correct way to do it. Let me watch you do it. Okay, great. Here's where you made a mistake. Now let's repeat that process. And you build this cadence where folks can be very effective in that interactive setting before they step out on the floor. I think that's the way in which technology is really going for training. But then the other side of it is, so if that's from an operations standpoint, I think some of the stuff that's coming out as it relates to sales training is phenomenal, right? So we have a ton of these AI platforms. And the old adage on training salespeople is, hey, make a whole bunch of cold calls, get kicked in the teeth, and like call it good. Or if you had a good manager, right, what would they do? They'd say, hey, we're going to do some fake calls, and they'd pick up the phone and they'd call you, and they'd act like a complete jerk, and you'd have to get through every objection. And, I don't ship with brokerages, get out of here. And you do all that stuff. Nowadays, the AI platforms allow us to have that consistent coaching evolution, right? So, hey, we're going to focus on objections today. How do we do that? Well, let's program the bot to turn around and give these types of objections to these folks that are picking up the phone and calling, right? And so I think it allows us to provide very specific, very detailed, very direct type of training into the areas in which people are struggling with the most versus pick up the phone, call somebody, and I'll give you feedback based on what I heard on the call. Now you can run through that in a very meaningful manner, and you can do a ton of time in the saddle before they actually make it out to the floor and do that first cold call or do that first outreach to a customer. It gives them that opportunity to truly train in an environment that is safe and allows for the proper coaching versus what we used to do in the past and things.
Yeah, and this is where the shameless plug is going to come in. If you think, like, so we have some of those simulations built into Sync, right? And if you think back to your first time calling a driver or calling a prospect, like, it's terrifying, right? Like, you have no idea what this person's going to say. Oh my God, they're a truck driver. So like, having these simulations allows you to, like, one, reinforce the training, but two, like you said, kind of practice these calls in a low risk environment before you're just fumbling your way through trying to figure out how to engage with this person for the first time. Have any of you guys used Duolingo by any chance?
Yes.
I just started using it. I think it's the coolest thing. And some of the things that they do that, like, we try to emulate to a degree are, like, I think technology really helps enable, like, the micro learning piece and kind of the asynchronous aspect of training. So, like, instead of sitting there bringing your entire like class or whatever into a training that lasts an hour, now with different LMSs and stuff, you can have each individual person go through the same training And it can be small little bits of micro-learning training, right? At different periods throughout the day. So it doesn't just tie everybody up into this one live session. Like that, I think that's a really cool way that technology does things. And I just think Duolingo is super cool. Yeah. That's all I got. Any parting comments or anything?
I think the only thing I'd say is, I mean, training as a whole, like, make sure that you have a plan in place, right? It can't just be, you came in, we onboarded you, you're good to go. Like, it has to be a complete process. Keep the main point the main point. Like, the main point is we want people to be effective. How do you do that? You have to have a training plan in play that has ongoing training, has onboarding training, has all kinds of different types of training built into it. You have to have that to be successful in the environment that we're in today.
Yeah, totally agree. All right. So we'll wrap things up here. You guys want to go around real quick, give your like name, company, contact information in case anybody wants to reach you? Rush, we'll start with you.
Sure. Rush Feldhacker. You can reach me at rush@neon-logistics.com.
Perfect. Dave?
Dave Stone. Email is dstone@omnilogistics.com, or find me on LinkedIn and we can connect that way.
Perfect. And Seth?
You can also find me on LinkedIn, or you can reach out to me via email at seth@growthnexus.io.
Perfect. All right. Anybody who was watching, I appreciate you watching. Like Rush, Dave, Seth, thanks a lot for joining me. I had fun. I thought it was a ton of useful information, and we'll see everybody next time. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Nick.